There's something quietly ironic about intelligence. We spend so much of our lives building it, refining it, trusting it completely. We read more books, gather more information, and develop sharper reasoning skills. And somewhere along the way, we start to believe that more intelligence will naturally lead to better decisions. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes, the very tools we've sharpened become the ones that cut us most deeply. Intelligence doesn't just help us see solutions. It also helps us build incredibly convincing justifications for the wrong choices. Think about the smartest person you know. Not the loudest or the most confident, but the one who genuinely understands complex ideas, who can hold multiple perspectives at once, who sees patterns others miss. Now think about a time they made a decision that, in hindsight, seems almost absurd. Maybe they stayed in the wrong relationship for years, explaining it away with increasingly elaborate reasoning. Maybe they invested in something risky because they'd constructed a beautiful logical framework that felt airtight. The decision wasn't random. It was supported by their intelligence, dressed up in reasoning so sophisticated that it fooled even them. This is the intelligence trap. It's not that smart people are careless. It's that intelligence gives us the ability to defend almost any position we've already emotionally committed to. We can build arguments like architects build buildings, layer by layer, beam by beam, until the structure looks solid from every angle. And because we're good at this, because the reasoning feels sound, we trust it completely. We forget that intelligence is just a tool. And like any tool, it can be used to build something true or to build something that merely looks true. The trap closes slowly. You don't notice it at first because everything seems logical. You're not being irrational. You're just thinking. But beneath all that thinking, beneath every well-reasoned argument and carefully considered point, there's often something much simpler. A fear, a desire, an assumption so deep you can't see it anymore. And your intelligence, instead of questioning that foundation, simply builds upward from it, creating a tower of logic on ground that was never solid to begin with. We've learned to equate thinking with intelligence. The more time we spend analyzing something, the more angles we consider, the smarter we feel. Overthinking feels productive. It feels like due diligence, like responsibility, like depth. And in a world that celebrates analytical thinking, it's easy to believe that more analysis always leads to better outcomes. But there's a point where thinking stops clarifying and starts obscuring, where consideration becomes paralysis wearing the mask of wisdom. Watch someone truly overthinking a decision. They'll gather information endlessly, weighing each piece with careful attention. They'll create mental spreadsheets, listing pros and cons, assigning weights to variables, running scenarios through their mind again and again. And the whole time, they'll feel like they're making progress. But often, they're just circling. The decision they need to make becomes less clear with each rotation, not more. Details that should be minor suddenly seem critical. Options that should be obvious become impossibly complex. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. When we overthink, we're often trying to achieve perfect certainty in a world that doesn't offer it. We're looking for the one right answer, the choice with no downside, the path forward with no risk. And because that option doesn't exist, we just keep thinking, keep analyzing, keep searching. Overthinking becomes a way to avoid the discomfort of choosing without perfect information. It feels like intelligence, but it's actually avoidance dressed in the language of careful consideration. Smart people are particularly vulnerable to this because they've learned to trust their analytical abilities. They've been rewarded their whole lives for thinking deeply, for considering multiple angles, for not jumping to conclusions. So when they find themselves unable to reach a conclusion, they assume they just need to think more. They don't realize that sometimes the problem isn't insufficient analysis. It's that they're analyzing the wrong question, or that the answer they need won't come from more thinking at all. Sometimes wisdom looks like knowing when to stop thinking and start trusting something quieter. Knowledge is supposed to be power. That's what we've always been told. The more you know, the better equipped you are to navigate the world. And in many ways, this is absolutely true. Knowledge opens doors, reveals possibilities, helps us understand complexity that would otherwise remain hidden. But there's a strange paradox that emerges when you accumulate enough knowledge. At some point, it stops being purely an asset and becomes something more complicated. It becomes a lens you can't remove, a filter that shapes everything you see, even when you need to see clearly. Imagine an expert in finance evaluating a simple investment opportunity. Someone with less knowledge might look at the fundamentals and make a straightforward decision based on basic risk and reward. But the expert sees everything. They see historical patterns, market correlations, macroeconomic indicators, behavioral finance principles, and 1,000 other variables. And while this knowledge could help them make a better decision, it often does something else entirely. It creates noise. The simple becomes complex. The obvious becomes questionable. They know so much that they can no longer see what someone with less knowledge would see immediately. This is how knowledge becomes a liability. It's not that the information itself is wrong. It's that we start privileging complexity over clarity. We assume that the sophisticated explanation must be more accurate than the simple one. We forget that sometimes the truth is actually straightforward. Smart people do this constantly. They'll dismiss their gut reaction to something because it feels too simple, too obvious, too unsophisticated. They'll override their instincts with elaborate reasoning, convinced that the complex analysis must be more reliable than their immediate impression. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The more you know about a subject, the easier it becomes to talk yourself into almost any position. You have more data points to cherry-pick from, more frameworks to apply, more historical examples to reference. You can build a case for nearly anything if you have enough knowledge to work with. So the very thing that's supposed to guide you toward truth can actually make it easier to rationalize whatever you've already decided to believe. Knowledge doesn't just illuminate. It also gives you the tools to justify, to explain away, to construct narratives that feel true but might not be. And the smarter you are, the better you become at this self-deception. Confidence and competence are supposed to go together. We assume that people who know what they're talking about are naturally more certain, more assured in their positions. And conversely, we tend to trust confident people, believing their certainty reflects genuine understanding. But reality is messier than this. Sometimes, the most confident people in the room are the ones who understand the least about what they're discussing. And sometimes, the people who truly grasp the complexity of a situation are the ones speaking most tentatively. This creates a strange dynamic, especially among intelligent people. Those who've studied something deeply often become less confident in their conclusions, not more. They've seen too many exceptions, too many nuances, too many cases where the obvious answer turned out to be wrong. They hedge. They qualify. They say things like, "It depends," and "in most cases," and "from what we currently understand." Meanwhile, someone with surface-level knowledge speaks in absolutes, their confidence unshaken by the complexities they haven't yet encountered. The illusion works because confidence feels like competence. When someone speaks with certainty, our brains register that as a signal of reliability. We're wired to follow confident leaders, to trust assured voices, to believe people who show no doubt. And smart people, knowing this, sometimes calibrate their confidence to match expectations rather than reality. They learn to sound certain even when they're not, to project assurance even when they're navigating genuine uncertainty. The performance of confidence becomes a skill in itself, separate from actual knowledge. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous for decision-making. When you're confident, you stop looking for information that might contradict your position. You stop questioning your assumptions. You move forward with certainty, and that certainty blinds you to warning signs you might otherwise notice. Intelligence amplifies this effect because smart people are good at finding evidence that supports their existing beliefs. They can construct convincing arguments for why they're right and why contrary evidence doesn't really matter. The confidence becomes self-reinforcing, a closed loop of certainty that's disconnected from reality but feels absolutely solid from the inside. We like to think of ourselves as independent thinkers, especially if we're intelligent, especially if we've spent time developing our analytical skills and learning to question assumptions. We pride ourselves on not following the crowd, on thinking for ourselves, on making decisions based on logic rather than social pressure. But there's something deeply human that sits beneath all that intellectual independence. Something older, more instinctive, harder to override than we'd like to admit. We are social creatures, and we are constantly, unconsciously, looking to others to validate our choices. Social proof works even on people who know exactly how it works. You can understand the psychology of conformity, you can study famous experiments, You can intellectually recognize that just because everyone believes something doesn't make it true. And still, when you find yourself in a room where everyone else has reached a conclusion, you'll feel the pull. You'll start questioning your own judgment. Maybe you missed something. Maybe they know something you don't. Maybe your reasoning, which felt so solid moments ago, has a flaw you haven't noticed yet. Smart people are particularly susceptible to this when the crowd consists of other smart people. If everyone at the meeting agrees on a strategy, if all the experts are aligned, if the consensus among people you respect is clear, it becomes almost impossible to maintain your opposing view with full confidence. You might voice it, you might present your reasoning, but internally, you're already halfway to doubting yourself. Because if all these intelligent people see something differently, what are the chances you're the only one who's right? The logical answer seems obvious. You're probably wrong. But crowds can be wrong. Even crowds of experts. Even consensus among intelligent, well-informed people can miss crucial factors or follow flawed assumptions that seem obvious only in hindsight. History is full of moments where the majority believed something deeply and turned out to be completely mistaken. Yet in the moment, social proof feels like wisdom. It feels like a form of evidence itself. And when you're making a decision, especially a difficult one, the weight of everyone else's agreement or disagreement becomes a factor you can't quite ignore, no matter how independent you believe your thinking to be. Logic tells you one thing, but the quiet voice asking, "What if everyone else is seeing something I'm not?" is always there, waiting. Intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. We know this intellectually, but we often behave as if they're interchangeable. We assume smart people are wise, that intellectual capability naturally translates into good judgment. But you can be brilliant at analysis and terrible at life decisions. You can understand complex systems and miss obvious truths. You can solve intricate problems and still make the same personal mistakes over and over again. Intelligence is about processing information quickly, seeing patterns, and understanding complexity. Wisdom is something else entirely. Wisdom has a different quality to it. It's slower, quieter, harder to define. It's not about how much you can think about something, but about knowing what to think about and when to stop thinking altogether. Wise people don't necessarily have more information than intelligent people. They just seem to know which information matters and which is just noise. They can hold uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. They can see the big picture without getting lost in details. And crucially, they seem to understand that some knowledge comes from experience, from feeling, from places that pure logic can't reach. Here's where intelligence can actually interfere with wisdom. When you're very intelligent, you learn to trust your reasoning above almost everything else. Your analytical mind has proven itself reliable, solved problems, gotten you where you are. So when that same mind analyzes a situation and reaches a conclusion, you trust it. Even when something deeper, some wordless knowing, is whispering that the conclusion is wrong. You dismiss that whisper as irrational, as emotion interfering with logic, as something to be overcome rather than listened to. Intelligence teaches you to override your instincts. Wisdom is partly about knowing when to trust them instead. The gap between intelligence and wisdom often shows up in timing. Intelligent people are good at understanding things in retrospect, at analyzing what went wrong or right after the fact. They can construct detailed postmortems, identify exactly where the error occurred, explain precisely why things unfolded the way they did. But wisdom operates in the present, in that moment before the decision is made. Wise people seem to sense which path to take even when they can't fully articulate why. They feel the right choice before they can think it through. And sometimes, that feeling is more reliable than any amount of analysis could ever be. The challenge is learning to recognize which moments call for intelligence and which call for wisdom, and having the humility to know the difference. Bad decisions don't always happen slowly. Sometimes, the worst choices we make come in an instant, without analysis, without careful consideration, without any of the overthinking we usually do. There's this assumption that if we just slow down, if we just think more carefully, we'll naturally make better choices. But speed isn't always the problem. Sometimes, a bad decision happens in a flash because we're smart, because our brain is so good at generating convincing reasons on the fly that we can rationalize anything in seconds. Think about how quickly you can justify something you want to do. Someone offers you an opportunity that feels exciting but risky. Your gut might hesitate, might sense danger, might recognize that this isn't actually aligned with your goals. But before that feeling can fully form, your intelligent mind has already constructed a case for why this is actually a great idea. It finds precedents, identifies potential benefits, minimizes the risks, draws favorable comparisons. All of this happens so fast you barely notice it occurring. Within moments, you've convinced yourself, and the decision feels obvious. This is intelligence operating at high speed, and it's not always helpful. Smart people are exceptionally good at instant rationalization. They can generate plausible-sounding reasons for almost anything fast enough that the reasons feel like they came first, like they're the actual cause of the decision rather than a justification constructed after the fact. The speed makes it feel authentic. If you can come up with a solid reason that quickly, it must be valid, right? But often, the speed just means you're good at reasoning, not that the reasoning is actually sound. The fastest bad decisions often come when intelligence meets emotion. You're angry, hurt, excited, scared. And your brilliant mind, instead of helping you pause and process that emotion, instantly deploys itself in service of whatever that emotion wants. If you're angry, it generates arguments for why you're justified. If you're scared, it constructs reasons to avoid it. If you're excited, it builds a case for why the risk is acceptable. The emotion decides, and intelligence simply closes that decision in logic so quickly you don't notice the sequence. You feel like you're thinking clearly, making a reasoned choice. But really, you're feeling strongly and thinking fast enough to disguise it as reason. And by the time you realize what happened, the decision is already made, already set in motion, already too late to easily reverse. We're drawn to what we know. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Familiar things are predictable, and predictability means safety. But familiarity does something subtle to our judgment. It makes things feel more correct, more trustworthy, more valid, even when they're not. We mistake the comfort of recognition for the signal of truth. And intelligent people, despite understanding this bias intellectually, fall into it just as easily as anyone else. Sometimes more easily, because they've spent so much time with certain ideas that those ideas have become invisible frameworks shaping everything they see. Consider how you approach new information. When you encounter an idea that fits neatly into your existing understanding, it feels right immediately. It clicks. It makes sense. You can integrate it smoothly into what you already believe. But when you encounter something that contradicts your current framework, even if it's well-reasoned and well-evidenced, it feels wrong. Not just incorrect, but somehow off, suspect, questionable. Your brain treats it like a foreign object, something to be examined skeptically, something that probably has a flaw you just haven't identified yet. Smart people build elaborate mental models over years of learning and experience. These models are sophisticated, nuanced, internally consistent. And because they work well most of the time, because they've helped make sense of so much, they become trusted, but they also become rigid. New information gets filtered through these existing models, shaped to fit, or dismissed if it can't be made to fit. The familiar patterns become the only patterns you can easily see. Alternative frameworks, even superior ones, feel foreign and uncomfortable. They require too much rearranging, too much rebuilding, too much admission that maybe the foundation you've been building on has flaws. This is how familiarity quietly guides decisions without you realizing it. You choose the familiar strategy over the novel one, the known approach over the experimental one, the comfortable interpretation over the challenging one. Not because you've carefully weighed the options and found the familiar choice superior, but because familiarity has given it an invisible advantage. It starts ahead in your evaluation. It feels right before you've even begun to analyze it properly. And your intelligence, rather than correcting for this bias, simply finds better and better reasons why the familiar choice is actually the logical one. The bias hides itself behind reasoning, using your own analytical abilities as camouflage. There's a kind of logic that has nothing to do with reason. It's the logic of emotion, the internal consistency of feelings, the way our hearts create their own systems of cause and effect that can feel just as rigorous as any intellectual argument. We don't usually call it logic because we've been taught to see emotion and reason as opposites. But emotions have their own intelligence, their own way of processing information, their own path toward conclusions. And sometimes, emotional logic leads to better decisions than purely rational analysis. The problem is learning to tell when. Emotional logic works differently than intellectual logic. It doesn't move in straight lines or follow formal rules. It makes leaps that seem irrational but are actually drawing on patterns your conscious mind hasn't fully recognized. You meet someone and feel immediate distrust, but you can't explain why. There's nothing obviously wrong, nothing your analytical mind can point to as justification. But the feeling is strong, clear, consistent. That's emotional logic. It's processing hundreds of tiny signals, reading body language and tone and pattern, arriving at a conclusion faster than you can think. Smart people often have a complicated relationship with emotional logic. They've been trained to privilege reason, to distrust feelings as unreliable, to seek objectivity. When emotion and reason conflict, they've learned to side with reason almost automatically. And in many contexts, this serves them well. Emotions can be misleading, can be triggered by irrelevant factors, can lead you astray. But emotions also carry information that reason can't access. They're plugged into parts of your experience and memory that don't translate easily into conscious thought. Dismissing emotional logic entirely isn't rational. It's just a different kind of blindness. The challenge is integration. Neither pure emotion nor pure reason is sufficient for making consistently good decisions. You need both, working together, each checking and informing the other. Emotional logic tells you something matters or something's wrong. Intellectual logic helps you understand what and why. But this integration is hard, especially for people who've learned to live primarily in their heads. They analyze their emotions rather than feeling them. They try to think their way to decisions that should come from a different place. And they wonder why, despite all their intelligence and careful reasoning, they keep making choices that lead to unhappiness or regret. The answer might be simpler than they think. Sometimes, you just have to feel something instead of figuring it out. We're told constantly that mistakes are valuable, that failure is the best teacher, that smart people learn from their errors and don't repeat them. And there's truth in this. Experience does teach, and sometimes you only understand something after you've gotten it wrong. But there's a myth embedded in this wisdom that we rarely question. The myth is that learning is automatic, that making a mistake naturally leads to understanding, that all you need to do is fail and the lesson will reveal itself. But learning from mistakes isn't automatic at all. It's actually quite difficult, and intelligence doesn't make it easier. Sometimes, it makes it harder. Here's what often happens when smart people make mistakes. First, there's denial. The mistake doesn't quite register as a mistake because the reasoning behind it was so solid. There must be external factors, unusual circumstances, bad luck. Then comes analysis. The mistake is examined in detail, broken down, understood intellectually. The error is identified, the lesson is articulated, perhaps even written down. Everything seems clear. The mistake has been processed, learned from, integrated. But then, months or years later, the same mistake happens again. Not exactly the same, but the same pattern, the same underlying error, just in a different context. This happens because intellectual understanding and behavioral change are not the same thing. You can understand exactly why you made a mistake without being able to prevent yourself from making it again. The knowledge lives in your head, but the habit lives somewhere deeper. Your analytical mind knows better, but your emotional patterns, your instinctive responses, your default ways of operating haven't actually changed. Intelligence lets you understand your mistakes in impressive detail. It doesn't necessarily give you the power to stop repeating them. Some mistakes were almost designed to keep making. They come from core patterns established early, from needs and fears so fundamental that knowing about them doesn't dissolve them. You might understand intellectually that you seek validation from unavailable people because of childhood patterns. You might be able to explain the psychology perfectly, but understanding the pattern doesn't stop you from falling into it when someone unavailable becomes interesting. The intellectual lesson has been learned completely. The behavioral lesson hasn't been learned at all. And this gap, between knowing better and doing better, is where smart people often struggle most. Intelligence gives you insight without necessarily giving you change. And sometimes, that insight just makes you better at explaining to yourself why you're doing the thing you said you wouldn't do again. After enough mistakes, after enough times when careful analysis led you wrong and gut feeling turned out to be right, something begins to shift. You start to notice that some of your best decisions came when you didn't overthink them. Times when you just knew something was right or wrong without being able to explain why. The knowing came first, complete and clear, and the reasons assembled themselves later. And slowly, reluctantly, you begin to trust that knowing. Not blindly, not without any thought, but you give it space. You stop dismissing it quite so quickly when it conflicts with your reasoning. Intuition is intelligence operating beneath conscious awareness. It's not mystical or irrational. It's your brain processing vast amounts of pattern recognition, experience, and information too quickly and subtly for consciousness to track. When you have a strong intuitive sense about something, you're not making it up. You're accessing a form of knowing that doesn't translate well into language, but is often remarkably accurate. The problem is that intuition can't show its work. It can't provide the logical chain of reasoning that proves it's right. It just is, and you either trust it or you don't. Smart people struggle with intuition because they've been rewarded their whole lives for showing their work, for explaining their reasoning, for justifying their conclusions. Intuition feels uncomfortably close to guessing. It feels unscientific, imprecise, risky. What if it's just wishful thinking? What if it's a bias you haven't recognized? What if you're confusing a feeling with insight? These are valid concerns. Intuition can be wrong, but so can careful analysis. The question isn't whether intuition is perfectly reliable. It's whether you've been systematically undervaluing a form of intelligence that might be telling you something important. Learning to trust intuition doesn't mean abandoning analysis. It means recognizing that sometimes, especially in complex situations with incomplete information, your analytical mind can't actually figure everything out. There are too many variables, too many unknowns, too much ambiguity. In those moments, intuition might be your most sophisticated tool, even if it can't explain itself. It's drawing on everything you know and have experienced, processing it in ways consciousness can't manage, and offering you a signal. Not a guarantee, but a signal. And maybe, after enough times ignoring it and regretting it, you start to listen. There's a kind of clarity that comes when you stop trying so hard to figure everything out. When you release the need to understand completely, to analyze thoroughly, to have good reasons for everything. Not permanently, not as a way of life, but in specific moments when thinking has stopped helping and started obscuring. You step back from the problem, stop turning it over in your mind, stop trying to force a conclusion. And sometimes, in that space, something becomes obvious that all the thinking had hidden. This isn't about being mindless or careless. It's about recognizing that consciousness has limitations. Your deliberate, analytical thinking can only hold so many factors at once, can only process so much complexity. When you try to force it to handle more than it can manage, it doesn't get more accurate. It just gets noisy. The signal-to-noise ratio drops. The important stuff gets buried under mountains of consideration. But when you stop pushing, when you let your mind rest and just see what's there, different parts of your intelligence can speak. The parts that work through pattern, through feeling, through knowing that doesn't need explanation. Smart people often resist this because it feels like giving up, like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that their intelligence isn't sufficient. And in a way, it is an admission that thinking alone isn't always enough. But that's not a failure of intelligence. It's just an accurate understanding of how knowing actually works. Some things become clear through analysis. Others become clear through stillness. Others through action, through trying things and seeing what happens. Thinking is one tool among many, and insisting on using it for everything is like trying to do all the carpentry with just a hammer. What emerges when you think less isn't absence. It's presence. You become more aware of what's actually in front of you instead of what you think should be there. You notice details you were too busy analyzing to see. You feel the weight of decisions differently, can sense which choices have energy behind them and which feel hollow. You start to recognize the difference between a conclusion you thought your way to and one that simply feels true at a deeper level. Neither is automatically better, but they're different kinds of knowing, and both are valuable. Maybe wisdom is partly about knowing which kind of knowledge a situation calls for, and being able to access both without insisting that one is always superior to the other. The journey through intelligence towards something beyond it doesn't mean becoming less smart. It means becoming more complete, letting all your ways of knowing work together instead of privileging one above all others. Using that brilliant analytical mind when it's useful, but not letting it drown out every other signal. Being smart enough to know when being smart isn't enough. And having the courage to trust yourself even when you can't fully explain why.